My name is Stuart King. I'm one of the owners of So Many Things in Mount Dora, Florida. So, you want to learn to quilt. This video is a basic quilting video. It's not meant to replace a live quilting class. It is meant to augment that live class, or for people who do not have time to attend a live class or don't have access to a live class. You don't need to know how to sew in order to quilt, but you do need to know how to use a sewing machine. And the other thing you need to know is how to sew a straight line. I recommend sewing on lined paper to perfect your straight line skills. You unthread the needle because you need to see where the holes are, so you do have to have a needle in. If you have an old needle that is perhaps dulled, then use that needle because your needle will be dull by the end of this project. You set your machine on straight stitch, and then you simply push down on the foot control, and what you are trying to do is have your holes line up with the lines in the paper. This will give you practice in sewing a straight line. Of course, there are other lines you will be sewing, like curved lines and etc. But right now, for the video, straight lines is where it's at. And then when you're done with the line, simply push the needle up, and then you can see how well you did on your line paper. And do this until you really feel comfortable sewing a straight line.
Stuart, I never practiced straight line sewing, which is pretty dumb considering how many quilts I've made. Tell us why it's important.
Well, when you sew a straight line, or in sewing a straight line, you are learning to control your fabric. When you're sewing, you don't want to push or pull the fabric through the machine. You want to let the machine do the work. But you do have to keep your fabric from going to one side or the other. And so sewing straight lines, you learn how your fingers feel when they are guiding your fabric to keep it straight. All sewing machines tend to move off to one side or the other. It's just the nature of the sewing machine. Some are better than others, but all of them will tend to move off to the side. So you do need to guide your fabric to get that nice continuous straight line. Now we've sewn several lines, and you might do pages and pages and pages of straight line sewing, and that is just fine. As long as you're comfortable with how you've sewn your straight lines, then you can move on to the next step, which is sewing on fabric. Before we do that, let's talk about what the machine does in order to quilt. It sews a 1/4 inch seam, or I should say you sewing a 1/4 inch seam on the machine. There are several different ways to sew a 1/4 inch seam. One way on the older machines, because they didn't have a 1/4 inch foot back then in the old days, is they put a piece of tape where a 1/4 inch seam was from the needle over, and thereby they followed the fabric along that piece of tape. Nowadays, most machines either have a 1/4 inch foot, or they have a 1/4 inch stitch, or sometimes they have both. The Juki that I'm sewing on is one of those machines. I much prefer to use the 1/4 inch stitch, which if you look over here at the screen, right now I'm on a straight stitch, and if I push number 3, you see it comes up with a 1/4 inch stitch. That means with my regular foot, the A foot, from the needle position to the edge of the foot, it's a 1/4 inch. That's one way to do the 1/4 inch stitch on this machine. The other way is with a foot that has a 1/4 inch from the center needle position. This foot, if you look, your needle goes right through that space right there, and this edge is your 1/4 inch. Another way to sew a 1/4 inch is with a guide. The needle once again is in the center position, and your fabric then follows this black guide. I prefer to use the edge of the foot, but these other 2 feet are ways to sew a 1/4 inch. I use, as I said, the 1/4 inch stitch on the machine. On this machine it's number 3, and then I'm sewing along the edge of the fabric, the edge of the foot to get my 1/4 inch seam. There are a couple other features I like to have on any sewing machine that I'm sewing on. One is a foot that lifts with the touch of a button. The second thing is a needle that goes up or down with the touch of a button, and that always either stops in the up position if I want it to, or in the down position if I want it to. And the third feature I like a machine to have is a trimmer. And that cuts the thread both top and bottom.